Welcome back to the Lights Out podcast, bedtime stories for boys and girls around the world. Good evening, boys and girls. Are you ready for bed? Are you all snuggled up and ready for another Lights Out bedtime story? Good, because you're in for a treat tonight. The first of 50 treats. That's right. I have got the box set of Mr. Men. And tonight's story is called simply Mr. Tickle, and Mr. Men is by Roger Hargreaves. Once upon a time, it was a warm, sunny morning. In his small house at the other side of the wood, Mr. Tickle was asleep. You didn't know that there was such a thing as a tickle, did you? Well, there is. Tickles are small and round, and they have arms that stretch and stretch and stretch, extraordinarily long. Mr. Tickle was fast asleep. He was having a dream. It must have been a very funny dream because it made him laugh out loud, and that woke him up. He sat up in bed, stretched his extraordinarily long arms, and yawned an enormous yawn. Mr. Tickle felt hungry, so do you know what he did? He reached out one of his extraordinarily long arms, opened the bedroom door, reached down the stairs, opened the kitchen door, reached into the kitchen cupboard, opened the biscuit tin, took out a biscuit, brought it back upstairs, in through the bedroom door, and back to Mr. Tickle in bed. As you can see, it's very useful indeed having arms as long as Mr. Tickle's. Mr. Tickle munched his biscuit. He looked out the window. Today looks very much like a tickling day, he thought to himself. So later that morning, after Mr. Tickle had made his bed and cooked his breakfast, he set off through the wood. As he walked along, he kept his eye very wide open, looking for somebody to tickle, looking for anybody to tickle. Eventually, Mr. Tickle came to a school. There was nobody about, so, reaching up his extraordinary long arms to a high window ledge, Mr. Tickle pulled himself up and peeped in through the window. Inside, he could see a classroom. There were children sitting at their desks and a teacher writing on the blackboard. Mr. Tickle waited a minute and then reached in through the window. Mr. Tickle's extraordinary long arm went right up to the teacher, paused, and then tickled. The teacher jumped in the air and turned around very quickly to see who was there. But there was nobody there. Mr. Tickle grinned in a mischievous grin. He waited another minute and then tickled the teacher again. This time he kept on tickling until soon the teacher was laughing out loud, saying, stop it, over and over again. All the children were laughing too at such a funny sight. There was a terrible pandemonium. Eventually, Mr. Tickle thought that he had had enough fun, so he gave the teacher one more tickle for luck, and then, very quietly, brought his arm back through the open window. Chuckling to himself, he jumped down from the window, leaving the poor teacher to explain what it was all about, which of course he couldn't. Then Mr. Tickle went to town. And what a day Mr. Tickle had! He tickled the policeman on traffic duty At the crossroads in the middle of town, he caused an enormous traffic jam. He tickled the greengrocer just as he was piling apples neatly on his shop window. The greengrocer fell over backwards and the apples rolled all over the shop. At the railway station, the guard was about to wave his flag to the train to leave. As he lifted his arm in the air, Mr. Tickle tickled him, and every time he tried to wave his flag, Mr. Tickle tickled him until the train was 10 minutes late, leaving the station, and all the passengers were furious. That day, Mr. Tickle tickled everybody. He tickled the doctor, he tickled the butcher, he even tickled old Mr. Stamp, the postman, who dropped all his letters into a puddle. Then Mr. Tickle went home. Sitting on his armchair in his small house at the other side of the wood, he laughed and laughed every time he thought about all the people he tickled. So, if you are in any way ticklish, beware of Mr. Tickle and those extraordinary long arms of his. Just think, perhaps he's somewhere about at this very moment while you're reading this book or listening to this podcast. Perhaps that extraordinary long arm of his is already creeping up to the door of this room. Perhaps it's opening the door now and coming into the room. Perhaps, before you know what's happening, you will be very well and truly tickled. The end of Mr. Tickle by Roger Hargreaves. Here on the Lights Out podcast. Bedtime stories for boys and girls and Mr. Tickles around the world. Good night. Stay tuned for the next episode of Mr. Men, which will be Mr. Greedy. Good night.